This story takes place when I was 14 female, now 23. It was late summer and I was coming home from hanging out at the beach for my best friend Mia's birthday party, who was turning 17. When I got off the subway at my stop, I looked at the bus arrival screen. The bus I would normally take home was arriving in an hour. And being a tired 14-year-old girl, I decided to take an alternate bus route home. This was a decision that I would later regret. When I get off the bus at the stop, I have about a 10-minute walk to my building. My area at night is pretty quiet, not many cars on the streets. As I'm walking up the street, I hear the sound of an engine nearby. I look over my left shoulder and I see a white panel van. I know, typical, rolling up the street. I try to think nothing of it, but when I turn onto my street, the van does too. Now I'm unsettled and start walking faster. This van is driving slowly and it never passes me. When I turn up the long driveway to my building, the van once again turns too. Now I'm really scared. The driveway to my building has an ice rink on the side of it with bright lights, so I walk beside the rink under the lights. There are small town houses on the other side of this driveway. The van catches up to me and stops, so I think maybe this person is lost and trying to ask for directions. I was trying to find some way to rationalize this. I stop and I stay about 4 feet from the van just in case. I look in the van window to see an older man, starting to bald with black hair and a white t-shirt. I ask if they are lost and they don't respond. Instead, they try to get me into their van. I say no and I start walking, but the van continues to drive slowly following me. When a red car begins to drive down the driveway, the van drives all the way to the end of it and waits for the red car to turn out before reversing to be beside me again. The man is still trying to get me into the van. I want to make a mad dash to my building, but I'm worried he will see where I live, so I just keep walking. When another car comes down the driveway, the van does what it did before, drive to the end and wait for the car to leave. But this time, there is a cab dropping someone off at the townhouses. The cabbie is closing his trunk when he sees me. "Are you okay?" he asks. I tell him how the van has been following me, and every time a car comes, the van drives to the end and waits for it to leave before following me again. He then tells me that he will get into his car and drive to the end of the driveway and sit for a bit, so I have enough time to run to my building. I tell him okay and thank you. The van is back in line with me again, so the man gets in his cab and drives up the driveway, and the van follows. I look and see the 2 vehicles sitting there, and I run up the rest of the driveway into my building's lobby. My heart is racing. When I get to my apartment, I'm still freaked out. I go into my room and call the cops. While I'm on the phone with them, I look out my bedroom window and see the van still. It's slowly driving around my building looking for me. Now I'm fully panicking. The cops sent officers to sweep the area, but they don't find him. And 2 officers came to my apartment to get a statement from me. About a week later after this happened, the officers come back to my apartment. They show me a photo of the man from the van that they were able to get from the security camera on the side of my building. I told them the man in the photo was the exact one that followed me. They told me that they found him and that he was being put on the sex offenders list. I live in a relatively safe city in Scotland, though I've had several really odd and scary encounters since I moved here 4 years ago. I'm a short 29-year-old woman and I work in a pub, so I often get out of work quite late, especially on weekends. I usually head home around 2 a.m. I never wear my headphones when headed home at night, so this particular night was no different than usual. Alarm set, doors locked and checked, said goodbye to my colleague, and then went our separate ways to get home. I usually have to cross a grocery store parking lot to get home. It's well lit. And that night something struck me as odd. There were a couple of cars parked there, which is normal, but something just felt wrong. I looked over my shoulder and clocked a guy in a hat walking a distance behind me. This wasn't weird, but I decided to keep an eye on him nonetheless. I exited the car park to the main road that I lived off of, but I still had a good mile or so to go before I reached my flat. I checked over my shoulder again, and sure enough, this guy was walking the same direction as me. The distance between us was starting to close, so I decided to cross the road. I usually did at this point anyway. Looking over my shoulder, I was able to not only look for traffic coming, but I was able to keep an eye on him. I crossed the road and I didn't bother to look back for a few minutes, assuming he had stayed on the other side. But I began to hear footsteps approaching. I I glanced over my shoulder and saw this guy was about 20 feet behind me. I had a soft drink in a glass bottle in my bag, and figuring I was overreacting, but better safe than sorry, I stuck my hand into my bag and gripped the bottle. Another 45 seconds, and this guy was close enough to touch me, but he slows to my pace and says, "Hello, how are you?" I ignore him and don't respond. I long ago gave up on pretenses of being polite if I feel uncomfortable. A stranger's feelings matter less than my feeling of safety in any given situation, but he persists in talking to me. "Hi, are you going to work?" "No." I was being short with him. "Are you going home?" "Yes," I said coldly. "Do you live in this direction?" I just looked at him, and he tried again. "Do you live off of this road?" "Where do you live? Do you live close by?" I didn't respond and slowed my pace, letting him walk on. I was still gripping the glass bottle, ready to hit him with it should he try anything. He tried to slow down so I would catch up with him, but I slowed down so much that I was barely walking at all. He was maybe 300 yards away at this point, and he simply stopped and turned around, watching me and waiting for me to catch up with him. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and tried my phone. Of course, my phone was dead. I figured it would last the walk home, but the dodgy battery had other ideas. Surprisingly though, I wasn't that afraid. He had started walking again, but still quite slowly. He looked over his shoulder again after another minute, and I seized the opportunity. There was a path to a block of flats that was obscured by tall hedges, so I leapt behind them. I waited for nearly 10 minutes, never letting go of that bottle the whole time. I peeked around the hedges to make sure he was there. I peeked behind the bins and bus stops to make sure he wasn't hiding and waiting. But as far as I could tell, I had lost him. Maybe he didn't mean anything by this, but if you suspect a woman is afraid of you and she is walking home alone at night, probably don't speak to her. It definitely will not help. Especially don't ask her where she lives repeatedly. I was not drunk, I didn't appear to be drunk or need any help. I was just walking home as I ordinarily would. I am, however, inclined to believe that he had bad intentions. I would rather be cautious than not. To start, let me explain myself. I'm 5'7", 113 pounds, and I was 16 at the time of the encounter. I'm a multi-sport athlete. Track, volleyball, basketball, and hockey. And I have insomnia. This all happened around 2 a.m. on August 10th of 2019. I had been over to my best friend's place because she had just returned home from a vacation, and she had birthday presents for me. Hoodies and gummies, if you're curious. I had spent almost an hour there already, and I wanted to head back home soon because honestly, my town is scary at night. Drug dealers, rapists, and murderers, you know the deal. So I waved goodbye to my best friend and I started walking down her street. I guess a party had just let up because behind me at the end of the road, about 20 or 30 yards from where I was standing, there were a couple of men walking across the crosswalk. They were both pretty tall, I'm guessing between 5'11" and 6'3". These two seemed harmless at first when I looked in their direction, but soon they came to a stop. They were both looking at me. At this point, I felt uncomfortable, so I just kept walking. That's when I overheard what one of them said. "Hey, that's a girl over there." At this point, I whipped my head around. They were starting to walk in my direction now, and one of these two men had moved over towards the sidewalk where there was no light. I knew at this point that something was wrong, and I began to pick up my pace. But they were still getting closer. I didn't know where the second guy was, but when I looked back, the first guy was still following me down the middle of the road. I think that they were planning to cut me off and try to trap me between the two of them. The minute I was about 13 yards from the T intersection, I started to run, and that's when the yelling started. Oh great, now she's running. I hooked a sharp right and then a left. I could still hear them behind me, and at this point, all I knew was that I couldn't stop moving. I had to lose him somehow. I was coming up to an apartment building with a small parking lot behind it. There were no lights. I made the split-second decision to veer off into the parking lot, and I squeezed myself under one of the cars. I don't know how long I waited there. It could have been a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. I watched the two men run past. They didn't bother to check under the cars, which was definitely in my favor. The minute I felt that I was safe, I backtracked and took a different route back to my house. I was too scared to take the main route, in the fear that I would have bumped into them. I know what I'm about to say is stupid, but I didn't go to the police. I wouldn't have been able to give a proper description of the men because I hadn't really seen their faces. But if there is anything I learned from my experience, it's that no matter where you are or who you are, you need to be extremely careful. You can think that part of the town or city you live in is safe, but that's not always the case. There is no protective barrier to keep out people with bad intentions. So please, whatever you do, watch your surroundings as your life depends on it. If I had been listening to my music and not paying attention, I hate to think what could have happened to me. About a year ago, I spent a decent amount of time working in a different city than I live in. One day was particularly cold, and the Airbnb I had booked was pretty far away. I didn't have a car, and I had failed to pack a warm coat. I ducked into the Kmart nearby to buy something I could wear on my walk, with the intention of returning it the following morning. My best option was this enormous XXL fuzzy bathrobe. My walk home led me through this beautiful botanic garden along a waterway. It was nearing midnight and I was halfway through my journey. I'm usually quite aware when I'm out, particularly at night, but I had let my guard down a bit, due in part to the enormous bathrobe I had wrapped around me. It was like wearing a fuzzy suit of armor. Suddenly, I felt intensely uncomfortable, but I couldn't put my finger on what I had heard. My immediate thought was a couple of males holding a whispered conversation. I rounded a corner and ducked into some trees, sucking my breath in and trying to understand what I was hearing. Light footsteps and voices. Two men neared my hiding spot on the path, and I internally berated myself for not being more careful. Nobody was out, so screaming would do nothing. I'm a very small woman, so the situation was one of my worst nightmares. As they passed, I heard, "She's around here somewhere." I felt physically sick, until one of the guys let out a low whistle and I heard the jingle of a collar. A dog scurrying past my spot, and a "good girl" followed by kisses. An intense sense of relief followed. They were talking about their beloved dog not hunting me. They seemed harmless, endearing even. I readjusted my bathrobe to cover my head. It was really cold. I popped out from the trees. I didn't realize until I later looked at myself in a mirror that the bathrobe's arms were now on top of my head, sticking out like some grotesque monster. I also didn't realize that the men had stopped, or they were walking very slowly, only a few meters ahead of the path. One of the men screamed in terror when they saw my emergence from the trees. The other swore loudly, and they both took off running across the bridge over the waterway, followed closely by their dog, who was now barking frantically. I still have the picture I took of myself in the mirror after that incident, and I get the giggles every time I see it. I moved to Chicago a couple years ago from a different city, and I always felt like I had the smarts and awareness to stay out of trouble. Of course, the best laid plans so often go awry, especially with the help of alcohol. I met up with my boss at a bar that was close from my apartment, and we decided to part ways shortly after midnight. I was always pretty adamant about taking a car home or not walking alone, but after a couple of beers and a few shots, I figured I could handle a 5-minute stroll. I waved him off when he offered to escort me, and watched as he got into his own ride, then started home. Soon after, I turned off the main road onto my street. My apartment was roughly 3 blocks away. As I approached the first cross street, a van pulled up and let me pass in front of it. I heard the back door quickly slide open and heard someone's feet hit the pavement. I took out my pocket knife and opened it, and I kept it tucked slightly in my sleeve. A quick glance let me know that a man was following behind me, head down and hood up, with the gap between us getting closer. While fighting off a heart attack and trying to decide whether I would fight back or not, I heard a quiet jingling coming from across the next street. A man appeared across from around the corner, walking 2 fairly large dogs. Without thinking, I ran across the street to meet him. In retrospect, I must have scared the shit out of him. I don't know if he saw my knife, but suddenly some girl came running over to him hissing, "I don't know this guy, can I please walk with you?" He looked at me like I was crazy and started trying to walk away, so I repeated it slower this time. "Hey, I'm really sorry, but I don't know the guy behind me." I looked back and watched my follower jump a fence, disappearing into a backyard. "Can I please walk with you?" Once he figured out what I was saying, he was completely understanding. Both him and his dogs were both super nice, and he ended up walking me all the way back to my apartment. Fortunately, I never got his name, but if you own a dog named Pumpkin, thank you. I've been lucky enough to have no further incidents,